Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos, and we focus on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, but also magnum opuses and tour de forces and earth-shattering discoveries, and mainly from obscure sources. And we try to hook you up with things that are pretty difficult. I try to kind of walk you through these texts, and in many cases I don't feel competent to break them down into pieces, and so I'll give you the verbatim, but I will probably intersperse comments. But we are on our 241st video, what is called the Reciprocal Church. First, we did about 300 videos on Tree of Life, ancient Egyptian Tree of Life, and about almost 600 videos on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson, which is the greatest all-encompassing theory that I know of. We went through several of his books and articles in all those videos, so check that out. It's a unification of all of science and a unification of science and religion. And so we're using his foundation to delve into the reciprocal church, looking at various authors or creators who spent their whole life working on something, never got any credit, never got any money, but really hit a home run, did a great job with what their research work, put it out there. Maybe it's not in the clearest language, because a lot of times they have to kind of invent their own language. So these things do still need to be refined and everything, but so we've put together these sources that is spiritual in nature, with a spiritual bent, things that you can use in your own life to get closer to that reverent state of inner peace that we have when we get close to the divine within us, or however you see it. And we are doing this mainly because we're trying to give you some options when you recognize that the Western religions are about to cave in, about to collapse, because they are not really cutting the mustard in terms of providing evidence for their existence, and a whole lot of evidence against their existence, or against their veracity. In particular, we're looking at the New Testament, and we'll get to the Old Testament later, but certainly from my research and from what's getting to be damn near a dozen scholars that I've looked at, the New Testament was written by the Romans. The Caesars, who had the Roman Empire at that time, and in the first century. And it was written at about the same time as the Gospels were written, about 40 to 50, 40 to 60 years after the original events, really 40 to 100 years after the original events were so-called took place. And this is the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, which includes Emperor Vespasian, his son Titus, from 69 until 81 AD, and then their brother Domitian, or Titus's brother Domitian, who ruled up until 96 AD. Domitian, I'm not sure about his participation, but definitely the first two, and they may have had a kind of a backroom participant named Arius Calpurnius Piso, who also had an alias where he was called Josephus. Josephus is the author of the New Testament, or at least the Gospels. I think that Pliny the Younger, a famous Roman rhetorician, was the author of the Pauline literature, the 13 or so books of Paul that Paul is attributed to. And then a few of Piso's sons also helped out with Pliny's work, and some of the sons then also wrote much later books like Hebrews and Revelation. And most of these scholars, 5 scholars recently, have all kind of independently figured out that the Gospels were written by Josephus, because they've read Josephus. And it becomes pretty much unmistakable that he's writing in unison with the Gospels. They are paralleling each other. They're parodying each other. They're bouncing back and forth between one and the other. They're constructing riddles and jokes that you need both of them to be able to understand. A typical parallel has Jesus, again, who they backdated to 40 years before their time, or more. And Jesus would prophesy, something using symbolic language, and then Titus, or possibly Vespasian, but usually Titus, the general. Vespasian started as the Roman general in this war against the Jews, between the Romans and the Jews, 66 to 73 AD. Vespasian was the general leading Rome, but at a certain point, Emperor Nero was assassinated, and then there was total chaos in the country. 3 people were named emperor in the year 69 AD, and all 3 of them were assassinated, and eventually Vespasian came in 69 AD. That was called the Year of the 4 Emperors, and it was really 4 assassinated emperors, because Nero was assassinated too. But Vespasian came in, and when he was named the emperor, I don't know exactly how they work these things. It's kind of armies are, support you, and, the political situation is a little bit different than it is now. Probably not a lot, but Vespasian was called to go to Rome, and so he left the reins of the military to his son Titus. So Titus became the general. And so what Jesus predicts in the Gospels symbolically is fulfilled literally by Titus in Josephus's history called the Wars of the Jews, or Jewish War. In many cases, these are kind of grim, dark, bawdy, disgusting, and even perverted stories that you can't quite see if you're just reading the New Testament, but when you start reading it along with Josephus at the right spots. And another way that you can tell the spot is the literal spot. So where Jesus predicts something at a certain spot, like where he's at the Sea of Galilee, or whether he's in the Temple of Jerusalem, or the Mount of Olives, or wherever, Gadara, wherever he is, and he predicts something, Titus is at the same location where he fulfills that thing. One example is the fishers of men example. In Luke, Jesus meets Simon and Andrew on the fishing boat and tells them on the Sea of Galilee, and tells them, come with me and I will make you fishers of men. And in Wars of the Jews, Titus is at the Sea of Galilee fighting a battle against the Jews, and they kind of like, I think they capsize the boat or something, and all the Jews fall into the water, and the Titus's men, just like Jesus's men, Simon and Andrew, Titus's men, are using their harpoons or whatever, and they're stabbing the Jews, and just like they're fishing for men. And they end up killing, thousands of them and leaving their bodies in the water. So it's a grim story, but it's an inside joke that the Romans are having at your expense. The Romans won the war, and so they get to, split up the spoils. They looted the temple at Jerusalem, and which apparently had incredible riches, and they used all of that loot to build the Colosseum, and then the Colosseum was built with Jewish slave labor, and then the games at the Colosseum featured Jews being eaten by lions and Jews in gladiator, fighting, but they were called Christians, so they didn't even get credit for their oppression, because they called them Christians, because there was a very fine line between Jews and Christians, as you can see from somebody like James, the brother of Jesus, who believed in Jesus, but he was Jesus' brother, so he was still a Jew. They were all Jews. It took this Christianity thing to convince them to become Christians. And that was done in order to mellow out the Jews, because the terminology that they use in the Gospels is to prune them or to domesticate them. Like when you have a wild plant and you prune it, it becomes a domesticated plant. And that is a theme that they run through in a really, really complicated set of riddles called the new root and branch. And we will get into that at a certain point, but we got to advance up to that first. Another example is, the scene of the crucifixion, and where Josephus' story gets to the scene of the crucifixion. By this time, Josephus, who, according to his autobiography, was originally a Jewish general in this war, but he eventually surrendered to Vespasian. And when he surrendered to Vespasian, he had the epiphany that God now favors the Romans instead of the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans. He gave Vespasian the prophecy that one day you're going to become emperor. And so when Vespasian did become emperor, he pardoned Josephus, adopted him into his family, and brought him to Rome to live at his own house there at the court of Rome, of the emperors, and became the resident historian. And so that's something that's very difficult to believe, but according to his own autobiography, he talks about how at a certain point he had surrendered to and I think Titus was kind of ushering him to Rome on his way from the POW camp he was at or whatever, and they went by a crucifixion scene, and Josephus saw that there were 3 of his friends that were being crucified, and he told Titus about it. This was after he already defected. He told Titus about it, and Titus the general, eventually to become emperor of Rome. And Titus stopped the procession and let Josephus go and negotiated with the undertaker, whatever, the executioner, and allowed him to take his 3 friends down from the from the crosses or from the trees that they were hanging on. And he says, but unfortunately, only one survived. And so this is a situation of 3 were crucified and 1 survived. So that's the parallel that, that the Romans use as kind of like a little game that they play to both mock their, to mock the Jews, but also to, play punning word games, which was kind of like a sport especially for the Roman elite. They would change languages. Most everybody, whoever could read, read Greek, which is the language of the Gospels and the language of Josephus. But sometimes they would insert a Latin word here or there, which was kind of the language of the Roman elite at that time. Anyway, now what we're looking at is going through the book of Michael Menescot's, Menasgotz, who wrote very recently, 2024, late 2024, called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. The Flavians were the dynasty of emperors beginning with Vespasian. Flavia means blonde or golden, and that's part of Josephus' name. When he was adopted, he became Flavius Josephus. Now, many scholars don't believe that Josephus ever existed, that this was just a pen name for Arius Piso, who was kind of like the shadow emperor, from what I can gather. But what Menescotz does is he looks at the book of Luke and he looks at Wars of the Jews by Josephus, and he graphs out all of the parallels on a spreadsheet or a graph paper, with the book of Luke on the vertical axis and Wars of the Jews on the horizontal axis. 24 chapters of Luke, 694 paragraphs of War of the Jews. Every time there's a parallel, he found 250 parallels between Wars of the Jews and the New Testament. Or no, not the New Testament, just Luke. 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And when he graphs them out, it spells a 5-letter word in Latin, APTVS. So don't quite know what to make of it, but I think that's a lot of signal and not a lot of noise. And way too many parallels for them to be a coincidence. Some of them are not obvious. Some of them are hard to dig out. And some of them are, maybe not the strongest in the world, but some of them are obvious and very strong too. So we were looking at one, I think I'm just going to read it over and then the analysis of it. Jewish War, paragraphs 562, 3, and 6. And that's counterparted by Luke chapter 19, verses 40 to 43. So in Josephus' War of the Jews, Titus, the son of the emperor, had, as mentioned, set camp at the Mount of Olives and had come to destroy Jerusalem. He bombards Jerusalem with great catapult stones, but the Jews see them coming because the stones are white. And since the stones are audible and visible, the Jews cry out, "The sun comes." Now that's the Greek translation. A lot of people think that Josephus meant the stone comes. But in Josephus, it actually says the sun comes, S-O-N. The suns are coming. So to address this, the Romans blackened the stone. So they colored the stones black so the Jews couldn't see them, but they could still hear them. At this time, a certain Jew was taken alive, who by Titus's order was crucified before the wall. And the Romans got control of the first wall on the 7th of June. Okay, now going to the book of Luke, chapter 19, verse 40. Also a little bit borrowed from Matthew 21, 24, and 28. Jesus was at the Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem and said, "I tell you that if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out." And when he came near, he beheld the city and wept, cried over it, saying, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days shall come upon you that your enemies shall cast a trench about you. Okay, so the first part of his analysis is before Jesus' crucifixion at the Mount of Olives, Jesus said, the stones will cry out, and this is hidden from your eyes, and they will dig a trench around you, and the sun will come again. And in one generation, or 40 years for the Jews, when summer is nigh, but his face will be different, and he says implicitly white, meaning Roman or Flavian. Okay, here in conjunction with Jesus describing his second coming, and so that's Titus is the second coming of Jesus. What Jesus predicts, Titus fulfills. So that was kind of the game for the Romans, is that they would get you sucked into Jesus as a hero, and then eventually Jesus as a savior. But then they would convince you that, well, actually Jesus is more like a prophet and is predicting Titus as the savior. And then eventually they would tell you that the Jesus part is fiction, so that you were in what they call pure emperor worship. So in conjunction with Jesus describing his second coming, he also talks about stones crying out and something being hidden from your eyes. The matching section in Jewish War describes how Titus fired stones that made a whizzing sound and led the Jews to cry out, the sun comes, until the Romans blackened the stones to prevent them from being seen. By equating the white stones coming with the sun coming, this is suggesting that the sun is white, therefore a white man or blonde, who is disguised by being blackened in the form of a Judean, implicitly non-white from their perspective, Jesus. The message here is that Titus is using subterfuge, and although initially disguised as a Jewish Messiah story, the Gospels are actually about worshiping a Roman or white, Flavian. This message, suggesting that the Flavians invented Jesus, the fact that it was probably their government propaganda team, is irrelevant, like as opposed to Titus himself, is clearly one that would only be revealed to the senior members of the secrecy cult, not only causing them to worship the divine genius of the Flavians, but also to feel superior to the new junior recruits. Yeah, so you get deeper and deeper, kind of like the Masons or something like that, where, you know, your first degree and then your second degree and your third degree, and each time you kind of learn more about it, so that the earlier position you have to reject. But you probably have to do some things to humiliate yourself in order to get to the next tier. And so everybody's kind of in on it in secret because they're all being blackmailed. Okay, now we're going to another parallel here. Jewish War, paragraph 568, and it's mixing up with Luke 17, verse 11. Titus brought a siege engine to the north wall, where that's a weapon, some type of, maybe a catapult or something like that. Titus brought a siege engine to the north wall, where a crafty Jew called Castor lay in ambush with 10 other men. Castor then rose and showed himself and begged Caesar for mercy, and appeared to openly exhort them to accept Titus's hand for their security. Now in Luke chapter 17, verse 11, he says, as he went to Jerusalem, there met him 10 men that were lepers, which stood afar off. And when he saw them, he said, go show yourselves to the priests. And one of them turned back and with a loud voice glorified God. Now, one part of the psychology that that is relevant here is that the Romans saw the Jews as a disease. Okay, so whenever they're talking about healing, they're generally talking about killing Jews. They saw the Romans, they saw the Jews as a sickness, as a plague, in this case as lepers. And healing them basically implicitly means killing them. Okay, this is a relatively simpler example where we can again see that God in Luke is equated with Titus in Jewish war. Okay, another parallel, Jewish War 574, and that's book 5, chapter 9, paragraph 4, and that goes with Luke 17 still, verses 27 to 32. And again, I urge you to get a copy of Josephus online, a free PDF, and do this exercise yourself, because you'll probably find parallels that he didn't find. You'll probably, find other things that are also very interesting between these parallels, because that's what this is. This is a big decoding session. That's exactly what the Romans wanted you to do, and they pretty much felt like, until you do this, we're going to continue to humiliate you with this stuff. So, Jewish War 574. Josephus found a place he could give a very long speech to those on the walls of Jerusalem, despite them jesting and throwing darts. And he mentioned, okay, so this is after Josephus has recanted or surrendered and then defected over to the Romans. So he's trying to speak to the Jews to convince them to surrender. Like, we can't win this. We got no chance. It's so much better. And so the Romans put him up there to give this speech to his own people, trying to convince them to surrender. And there were there seemed to be quite a few of the elite Jews who took that position. So Josephus, like the Herod family, now they weren't pure Jews, I guess. Well, they had Hasmonean or Maccabean descent lines, however. But Josephus found a place he could give a very long speech to those on the walls of Jerusalem, despite them jesting and throwing darts. And he mentioned that the Palestinians carried away our sacred ark, but God's wrath on them caused them to excrete their entrails and have ulcers in their privates. Okay, now Luke says, Luke 17, chapter 17, verse 27. They ate, drank, and married until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood destroyed them all. Likewise, it was in the days of Lot. But the day Lot left Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. God's wrath. Remember Lot's wife? Lot's wife is the one who looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. This parallel was quite easy to find, since there is only one place in both stories that discusses Noah's Ark. So one place in the New Testament and one place in Wars of the Jews that discusses Noah's Ark. With the benefit of a computer, a search for Ark immediately located it. However, as always, the author tries to conceal the links. So to find a reference to Sodom in Luke required observing that this location is discussed in the story of Lot's wife that Luke refers to. So he says, it says in Wars of the Jews, Palestinians carried away our sacred ark, but God's wrath on them caused them to excrete their entrails and have ulcers in their privates. He says that's a reference to sexual immorality as epitomized in Sodom. So I'd say that's, somewhat of a stretch, but it's not really a stretch because they're both dealing with Noah's Ark, and there clearly are enough parallels there to recognize that there are, they are written by the same person. They are working together intertextually. Okay, let's see. Yeah, that's interesting. He says the parallel was easy to find, but anyway, it's easy to find, but it's not that strong. It's there. That's one of the ones that if you're looking for it, it's there. But if you're not looking for it, you'd probably not see that. But it is the only place in both books that talk about Noah's Ark, so there is a natural parallel there. Once again, here I plot the locations of all the parallels described so far, highlighting the recent ones so that the reader can assure themselves that I am plotting them all accurately. Okay, now the full plot is on my thumbnail. So if you look at the thumbnail for this video, you'll see the full APTVS plot. Now, what he's doing so far, all of the parallels that we've seen so far are in the on the right-hand side of the V, or it's really a U and a V are the same in Latin, and so it's on the right-hand side of the V. It's the part that is kind of, as you go further through the book of Luke, you also go further through Wars of the Jews. So the parallels are basically in order. And there are many parallels that are exactly in the same order. So that really shows that the 3-year ministry of Jesus is parallel to the 3-year military campaign of Titus. They go to the same places in the same order and participate in conceptually parallel events. Jesus mostly symbolically, Titus mostly literally. Okay, now, so he plotted these points, and I think that's where we'll stop and take over. Okay, whilst these latest parallels have started to diverge from being a straight line, the right-hand side of the V in the APTVS pattern is slowly becoming clear. All right, thanks for tuning in.